This is Zora Neale Hurston, anthropologist, folklorist, journalist, documentary filmmaker, researcher of hoodoo and Caribbean voodoo, first person to photograph a zombie, and writer of the best love story ever told. Which love story, you ask? This one, Hurston's 1937 novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, an absolute masterpiece meditation on that most eternal of themes, love. The best meditation on the subject in the history of fiction. And what astounds me the most is that Hurston wrote it in just 7 weeks. 7 weeks! Now, have I read every love story ever written, you ask? No. Do I have the right to make such an audacious claim? Absolutely not. But is Their Eyes Were Watching God a peerless, cosmic, staggering novel that moved me to my core and immediately took pride of place in the top 3 books I've ever read? Oh yes. And I'm here to tell you why. This is a love story filled with the unexpected. Yes, it's about the search for romantic love, but it's also a story about identity, race, individualism, community, sorrow, grief, and passion. It strips away what you expect a love story to be, sloughs off what you expect a love story to do, and delivers something raw, vital, fresh, and extremely moving. If there's a happily ever after to be found in this novel, it's not the kind that sees Janie, the protagonist, running off into the sunset with the man she loves. It's a happiness rooted in self-assuredness, in loss, in endings, and in death. How Hurston writes Janie as a fully fledged, well-rounded, complex, real character, and how she writes about death in the most vital, alive, and stimulating prose in a way that turns the tables on what we're taught to think and feel about dying and endings, makes this, for me, the best love story ever told. But first, a little background. Who was Zora Neale Hurston? Was she really the first person to ever take a photograph of a zombie? And how, in 7 weeks, did she take the well-worn pillars of love and death and turn them into such an enduring, resonant, and unique literary masterpiece? Before we get into all that, welcome. My name is Dr. Rosie Whitcombe, this is Mousy the Marvellous, and we make videos on lots of literature, from the spooky to the sublime to the searingly beautiful, so please subscribe if that's your jam. A gigantic thank you to our patrons over on Patreon. We are so grateful for your support, as always, and if you fancy joining them, there's a link down below. And before we get started, please be aware that this video includes discussions of racism and death. With all that out of the way, let's turn back the clock and get acquainted with Zora Neale Hurston, born over 130 years ago on the 7th of January, 1891. Hurston grew up in Eatonville, Florida, which in 1887 became the first black incorporated town in the US. This meant that it was a self-governed, all-black town, and spending her formative years in this environment had a huge impact on Hurston. As Janine Bradbury tells us,
growing up in an all-black town, where actually the conflict with white people isn't the central drama of everybody's day-to-day life, is a very particular type of black experience.
Absolutely, yes.
And I think that kind of explains why Zora Neale Hurston was peripheral to, in some ways, the experiences of her peers.
Now, this is interesting, this use of the word peripheral. It suggests that Hurston is removed somewhat from what might be considered the usual experiences of black people living in the southern United States at this time. And indeed, being on the outside of things, perceiving the world in a way that is often at odds with the status quo, speaks to what we know of how Hurston lived her life. She was certainly not without a strong sense of community, but she was also very much an individualist. Look at this from her essay, How It Feels to Be Coloured Me, in which she discusses her experiences of racism and how her perception of her own race fluctuates.
At certain times, I have no race. I am me. The cosmic Zora emerges. I belong to no race nor time. I am the eternal feminine with its string of beads. Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me.
What stands out to me here is Hurston's characteristically wry humour, her passion, but also her strong and guiding sense of self and self-assuredness. Her pointed individualism is very much at the fore in this quote, but really it's evident before we even get to the main text of this essay. Hurston's powerful self-confidence is baked into the title itself. This essay isn't called How It Feels to Be Coloured. Hurston makes it known that she isn't speaking for a collective. She's telling us how it feels to be coloured her specifically. And I think Hurston's use of the word coloured here might be ambiguous. She's referring to her blackness, but is she also referring to the colours that make up her personality? The colours of the world as she perceives it? The colours that make up the magical, powerful being that is the cosmic Zora? Another, and an especially entertaining indicator of Hurston's confidence, determination, and strong sense of self-worth, is her notorious proclivity for lying about her age. At various times, she listed her birth date as 1898, 1899, 1900, 1901, 1902, 1903, and 1910. When she decided, age 26, that she wanted to study, she lopped 10 years off her age to qualify for free school attendance, and she successfully fooled her classmates and teachers that she was in fact a 16-year-old child. This boldness, this autonomy, and this sense of being unapologetic about who she is never seems to leave her. Hurston spent much of her time engaging with various strands of activism. For her first assignment as an anthropology student, she measured the heads of fellow Harlem residents in an effort to disprove theories of racial inferiority. She worked as part of the team that designed and brought to market the first realistic black baby doll. She was instrumental in what would come to be known as the Harlem Renaissance, a collective of black writers and artists based in Harlem, New York, who sought to define themselves and their community outside of white stereotypes. She was a prolific writer of novels, short stories, plays, essays, articles. She studied magic, hoodoo, and folklore, and was indeed famous for being the first person to photograph a zombie. It's probably best that Hurston herself explains that one.
And this particular zombie, whom I photographed, whom I think I'm the first person on Earth, and probably the last one to ever photograph a zombie, she had died in 1907. And nobody saw her anymore until 1936, when she was found naked on a road.
What is especially significant about this, I think, is that it demonstrates Hurston's passion for collecting and preserving information. She lived around the world, photographed and recorded a wealth of data, so many folk tales, folk songs, and testimonies that otherwise would have been lost. We owe Hurston a great debt. She was an absolute, unabashed pioneer. Adjoa Andoh puts it best when she says
she had this sense of wanting untold stories to be told. Her work as an anthropologist took her to Africatown in Alabama, and she filmed a guy called Cudjoe Cazola Lewis. He was the last surviving trafficked African man who'd been brought in illegally after slavery had been abolished in terms of the trade of trafficking into Alabama, and she has the only footage of this man alive because she was out there in the 1920s. And as a result now, there's a beautiful documentary called Descendant, and as a result of that documentary, building on the work of Zora Neale Hurston, the people of Africatown are starting to protect themselves against companies who are buying up their land, and she took the first step in recording it, travelling by her own lights because she wanted to make sure that people's lives were known.
Meeting Lewis, who was born Alule Kosala, had a big impact on her. Even though none of his family was still living and likely came to horrific ends, he believed they were waiting for him. He missed them.
I know they hunt for me. There was a tragic catch in his voice, like the whimper of a lost dog. After 75 years, he still had that tragic sense of loss, that yearning for blood and cultural ties, that sense of mutilation. It gave me something to feel about.
It's things like this, like preserving the legacy of one of the last surviving victims of the Atlantic slave trade, that makes Hurston a pioneer. But, like most pioneering individuals, her life wasn't without conflict. When she was just 16, yes, actually 16, not 16 going on 26, she nearly killed her stepmother with a hatchet, which is giving Lizzie Borden vibes, whose literary reputation you can learn more about here. I'll put a link in the description. She was married 3 times, was the subject of scandalous accusations, which were proved to be entirely untrue, but which deeply affected her, and couldn't seem to help but feel love and loss to their absolute agonising fullest. She writes in her autobiography,
"Because I have known the joy and pain of deep friendship. I have served and been served. I have made some good enemies for which I am not a bit sorry. I have loved unselfishly, and I have fondled hatred with the red-hot tongs of hell."
She was also readily in conflict with some of her contemporary black artists and writers over her literary portrayal of black people. As Andoh puts it,
they got a bit sniffy with Zora Neale because of her absolute determination to make work in the language of the people as they spoke. Colloquialisms were absolutely present, and some people felt that that was pulling down the race.
And we very much get these colloquialisms in Their Eyes Were Watching God. All the dialogue in the novel, all the conversations characters have with one another, is written to approximate an early 20th century Black Southern American dialect. The poetical, lyrical narration works in tandem with what Mary Helen Washington calls the vivid, metaphorical language of the Black community that really brings Hurston's characters to life, gives us a strong sense of their cultural, communal identity, and takes us deep into Black folk traditions. But, it would seem, many of her contemporary Black writers didn't agree with Hurston's practice. Her propensity for studying and incorporating Black folklores and dialects into her work was considered by some to be undignified. As Stephen Spencer writes, unlike many of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance, Hurston became immersed in the folk culture that so many others viewed with either nostalgia or disdain. Her contemporaries wanted to move away from this. It was old hat. It didn't elevate Black writing and art in the way they wanted. Equally problematic, to some, was Hurston's controversial attitude when it came to the portrayal of race relations. Many of Hurston's contemporaries viewed literature as an occasion for direct confrontation with white America's racial practices. During a period when racial violence increased and racism continued to be reflected in both popular culture and official government policy, why did Hurston steer away from the themes of resentment, anger, and despair in the Black community? Hurston's work, it was argued, didn't depict the reality of Black suffering, and that was a problem. However, not everyone shared this view. To some, this kind of criticism really missed the point of Hurston's work. As Washington argues, what is significant about the all-Black setting of novels like Their Eyes Were Watching God is that it enables the novel to escape one of the plagues of Black literature. A Black writer reflects, if he is not careful, but one aspect of his people's experiences: suffering, humiliation, degradation. And he may fail to show that Black people are more than simply reactors, that among ourselves we have laughter, tears, and loving that are far removed from the white horror out there. In Washington's view, Hurston isn't ignoring issues of racism or pandering to white patrons, as some suggested she was doing. She's incredibly conscious of race relations and racism. She just doesn't portray it in the same, more direct way of a lot of her contemporaries. As Spencer argues, Hurston is subtle. It's the subtext of her work that speaks to the issue of race. She exposes the worst kind of racism, the kind that is so deeply ingrained that it is invisible. Such a subtle, sophisticated analysis of racism is present throughout Their Eyes Were Watching God. There are lots of examples I could give from the novel to support Spencer's claim here, but I'm going to focus on just one: Janie's interactions with her neighbour, Mrs. Turner. Mrs. Turner, writes Mary Helen Washington, hates her Black self and everything that reminds her of how far away she is from being white and right. Indeed, as Hurston writes,
Mrs. Turner, like all other believers, had built an altar to the unattainable, Caucasian characteristics for all. Behind her crude words was a belief that somehow she and others, through worship, could attain her paradise, a heaven of straight-haired, thin-lipped, high-nose-boned, white seraphs.
So, Mrs. Turner is a Black woman who privileges other Black people if they have Caucasian characteristics. She favours Janie for this reason.
And when she was with Janie, she had a feeling of transmutation, as if she herself had become whiter and with straighter hair.
This interaction, and Mrs. Turner's character as a whole, deftly touches on the complexities of race relations, reminds us of the different and complicated ways racial prejudice can and does take shape, and demonstrates something of Hurston's genius for subtlety. This isn't a depiction of horrific violence, but it is an unsettling expression of a more nuanced form of racism, an ideology that doesn't explode, but gives way to a slow and constant rot. Now, this kind of portrayal may not have been favoured by Hurston's contemporaries, but despite such conflicts, Hurston persisted in her unique depiction of Black communities and earned success as a writer in her lifetime. However, this success was relatively short-lived. Hurston died in obscurity in 1960. Her revival in recent decades is very much the work of writer Alice Walker, who ensured Hurston didn't sink into the ether and made it possible for a wide range of readers to know the exquisite experience that is reading one of her books. Thankfully, Hurston has been remembered. We now know her, as Ando puts it, as a woman with appetite. She's flamboyant, has
an absolutely rigorous, determined approach. She was a self-starter and a goer by her own lights, regardless of other people's views and opinions, and I love that.
And Hurston very much shares these electrifying qualities with her female characters, like Janie, who greets us in the pages of her writing, full of great energy, resourcefulness, and heart.
She was stretched on her back beneath the pear tree, soaking in the alto chant of the visiting bees, the gold of the sun, and the panting breath of the breeze, when the inaudible voice of it all came to her. She saw a dust-bearing bee sink into the sanctum of a bloom. The thousand sister calyxes arched to meet the love embrace, and the ecstatic shiver of the tree from root to tiniest branch, creaming in every blossom and frothing with delight. So this was a marriage. She had been summoned to behold a revelation. Then Janie felt a pain, remorseless, sweet, that left her limp and languid.
This passage is symptomatic of Hurston's brilliance. There's just so much going on here. It's like a rich tapestry that tells us so much about Janie and about what's going to be important in this novel. This is a rapturous day for Janie. It's the day on which she tells us that her conscious life had commenced. She is experiencing an awakening, religious, sexual, and very dramatically and characteristically teenage. This is the start of Janie's coming-of-age story. We bear witness to her naivety, feel her passion, the romance of her imagination, and we share in her frustration.
Oh, to be a pear tree, any tree in bloom, with kissing bees singing of the beginning of the world. She was 16. She had glossy leaves and bursting buds, and she wanted to struggle with life, but it seemed to elude her. She searched as much of the world as she could from the top of the front steps, and then went on down to the front gate and leaned over to gaze up and down the road, looking, waiting, breathing short with impatience, waiting for the world to be made.
Thus begins Janie's story, under the blossoming pear tree, and we, as readers, watch as Janie's world comes into being, as she takes steps and pains to map out her life and her desires, as she experiences revelation after dazzling revelation. But where do we go from here? From the backyard and the abundant pears? What about the structure of Janie's story? How does this unfold practically? Well, the narrative revolves around Janie's 3 marriages, and a brief rundown of those marriages goes something like this. In her first marriage to Logan Killicks, she's treated as a worker. She doesn't want the marriage, and she's forced into it. Her second marriage to Joe, or Jody, is an exciting prospect, one which she does choose, but which doesn't end well. Joe comes to dominate her, is ever power-hungry, and routinely silences her. At last, she finds a powerful, physical, emotional, and spiritual connection in her third marriage to Tea Cake, who encourages her interests, her playfulness, her love, and her passion. What I like about this order of things is that Janie's isn't a story of reckless young love. There's nothing necessarily wrong with reckless young love, but we see a lot of it. It's a precedent set by one of the world's best-known love stories, Romeo and Juliet. But what if you're not a star-crossed lover? What if instead of embarking upon your whirlwind romance in your teens, you find it later in life? It's very interesting and deliberate, I think, that Hurston has Janie fall most passionately in love as an older woman. Through her other marriages, she develops a sense of what she wants, what is right for her, and she knows it when she finds it. But more prominent in the narrative, I think, is Janie's evolving love for herself. And it is in this way that Their Eyes Were Watching God expands and explodes the confines of what a love story can be. Hurston gives us so many different kinds of love. Not only does Janie find the deep, passionate, spiritual, sexual love she's been looking for in her last marriage to Tea Cake, but she experiences a deep, complex and growing love for her own person. Janie is, to my mind, more herself than any other literary character I've ever read. This isn't a novel about conventional happily ever afters. We're with Janie through and after each of her marriages ends, and even after we leave the novel, we get the sense that Janie's magic, her power, her love for life is ongoing. Janie is so powerful without being obnoxious or domineering, which is rare in powerful characters, I think. The moment her power really crystallised for me, and after which I was truly hooked on this book, occurs just after the death of Jodie, Janie's second husband. They've been married for almost 20 years, and during that time, any affection they had for one another has severely eroded. Eventually, Jodie becomes seriously ill and bans Janie from tending to him on his deathbed. But shortly before he dies, she breaks this rule, goes into his room and speaks with him. He's really horrible to her, as he has been for years, but she lets him have it. Not long after, Jodie dies, and we get this absolutely beautiful passage, during which Janie seems to unfurl, as though a new sense of self and of self-assuredness has come to her.
She was full of pity for the first time in years. Jodie had been hard on her and others, but life had mishandled him too. Poor Joe. Maybe if she had known some other way to try, she might have made his face different. But what that other way could be, she had no idea. She thought back and forth about what had happened in the making of a voice out of a man, then thought about herself. Years ago she had told her girl self to wait for her in the looking glass. It had been a long time since she had remembered. Perhaps she'd better look. She went over to the dresser and looked hard at her skin and features. The young girl was gone, but a handsome woman had taken her place. She tore off the kerchief from her head and let down her plentiful hair. The weight, the length, the glory was there. She took careful stock of herself, then combed her hair and tied it back up again. Then she starched and ironed her face, forming it into just what people wanted to see, and opened up the window and cried, "Come here, people! Jodie is dead! My husband is gone from me!"
One of the reasons Janie is such a well-written character is down to the complexity of her emotional experience. In the run-up to and aftermath of Jodie's death, she's angry and upset, and empowered and compassionate. Hurston makes it so that many feelings can be true at once, and as a result, Janie feels like a real, living, breathing, conflicted person. I love Janie's blossoming in this passage. After years of being told she's old and over the hill by her darling husband, she recognises that, rather than wilting away, she has grown into a handsome woman. She sees what she wants to see, not what Joe wanted her to see. She can finally make room for her own perception of things. She doesn't just take off her kerchief, but tears it off, letting down her hair, something Joe didn't allow her to do of her own accord. And look at the language Hurston uses here to describe Janie's hair. The weight, the length, the glory was there. There is presence here, physical presence. She's taking up space and making herself known. She finds glory, a word typically associated with masculine conquest, in herself, in who she is, without having to look for external validation. This is a significant moment of awakening, of learning, and of self-acceptance. Now, you might be thinking, well, yeah, but at the end of the passage she tucks her hair away again and goes from this state of liberation to donning a forced public persona. Doesn't that suggest that she's not actually liberated at all? And to that, I would say we need to go back to this idea that multiple things can be true at once. Janie has experienced self-empowerment, and she's part of a community that will expect certain things of her. And as one of my students actually pointed out to me, there's a clue in Janie's dialogue that hints at how, even when she's tucked her hair back away, she's putting herself first. Janie centres herself in this situation. Her husband has gone from her. She is, from the very beginning of her grief, centering it on her experience, rather than dissolving into the background and grieving as a quiet appendage to the great man that was her husband. And this is only the start of Janie's very individual, ever-growing and ultimately empowering experience of grief. At Joe's funeral, she plays the part of the widow. She starched and ironed her face and came set in the funeral behind her veil.
Inside the expensive black folds were resurrection and life. She did not reach outside for anything, nor did the things of death reach inside to disturb her calm. She sent her face to Joe's funeral, and herself went rollicking with the springtime across the world.
Again, we get this beautiful balance between Janie's internal and external worlds. Outwardly, she is grieving, but inwardly, she's happy and free. She experiences an internal springtime that suggests that Jo's death functions for her as a form of rebirth. And if this wasn't empowering enough, Janie's relationship with death and grieving develops throughout the novel, according to her tastes and her needs. At Tea Cake's funeral, spoilers, he dies too, Janie consciously chooses not to don the expected clothing and countenance of a widow, as she did after Jo's death.
No expensive veils and robes for Janie this time. She went on in her overalls. She was too busy feeling grief to dress like grief.
I love this quote. Too busy feeling grief to dress like grief. How beautiful and raw and brave. Janie does away with the conventions and the shoulds of grief and does it her way. Finally, her internal and external worlds match up, and she doesn't feel the need to dress up to appease her peers. Not only does this say something about the rarity and closeness of Janie's relationship with Tea Cake, but it also shows us how much she's grown into herself. She's arrived at a confidence and self-assuredness that means she can be who she wants to be without caring what anyone else thinks. Janie experiences death fully and wholeheartedly and without pretense. And this brings us to the very end of the novel and to the most stunning writing I have ever read on the subject of death. So Janie has just finished talking to her friend Phoebe here, telling her about her extraordinary life with Tea Cake. She's recounted it all, from her first unhappy marriage, through her second, to her great love with Tea Cake and his untimely death. And, I think you'll agree, she's come a very long way from the 16-year-old looking, waiting, breathing short with impatience, waiting for the world to be made.
Soon everything around downstairs was shut and fastened. Janie mounted the stairs with her lamp. The light in her hand was like a spark of sun stuff washing her face in fire. Her shadow behind fell black and headlong down the stairs. Now in her room, the place tasted fresh again. The wind through the open windows had broomed out all the fetid feeling of absence and nothingness. She closed in and sat down, combing road dust out of her hair, thinking. The day of the gun and the bloody body and the courthouse came and commenced to sing a sobbing sigh out of every corner in the room, out of each and every chair and thing. Commenced to sing, commenced to sob and sigh, singing and sobbing. Then Tea Cake came prancing around her where she was, and the song of the sigh flew out of the window and lit in the top of the pine trees. Tea Cake with the sun for a shawl. Of course he wasn't dead. He could never be dead until she herself had finished feeling and thinking. The kiss of his memory made pictures of love and light against the wall. Here was peace. She pulled in her horizon like a great fish net, pulled it from around the waist of the world, and draped it over her shoulder. So much of life in its meshes. She called in her soul to come and see.
Here, in this incredible conclusion to an incredible novel, Janie is finally done waiting, done horizon chasing. Life is here, now, and she is living it entirely and unabashedly for herself. What we're told is that this is no ending. Death is no ending. Janie creates her own reality and tells her own story from her perspective. Here, on her very own porch, she exercises her independent and hard-won voice and tells her story in her own words and at her own pace. We leave Janie at the novel's end feeling and thinking and resting in a room that is hers entirely, living a life that is hers entirely, utterly enchanted and in love. With Tea Cake? Yes, but with more than just Tea Cake. Unlike many a love story, the heroine doesn't sacrifice herself to the hero, and we see this played out in a very literal way close to the novel's end when Janey, more spoilers, shoots Tea Cake. So I've mentioned that Tea Cake, the man you might argue is the love of Janey's life, dies, and this is how he dies. He catches rabies and starts losing his senses, becoming aggressive towards Janey, and he tries to kill her. So she shoots him out of self-defense. She quite literally refuses to sacrifice herself to him. Though she loves him madly, she doesn't succumb to him. She chooses life, her life, over him. So yes, Janey is in love with Tea Cake, but she is also passionately in love with herself, with her experiences, with life itself, and all its possibilities stretching out before her. And without being too speculative, this sense of endless possibility, this lust for life, is very much the feeling I get when reading about Hurston herself. I want to reflect on what is possibly my favourite quote from near the end of her autobiography, Dust Tracks on the Road, that really conjures that sense of self-love and self-fulfilment, and an excitement and ever-burning enthusiasm for life that Hurston shares with Janey.
I can look back and see sharp shadows, highlights, and smudgy in-betweens. I have been in sorrow's kitchen and licked out all the pots. Then I have stood on the peaky mountain, rapping in rainbows, with a harp and a sword in my hands.
Hurston's magic and power is encapsulated in this quote. Her unabashed individualism fizzes off the page, and it's precisely this vibe that we get with Janey at the end of the novel, and which makes this the best love story ever written, because it's not strictly a story about romantic love. Nor is it a story about race, or death, or God. It's a story about Janey, about the way she chooses to love. And all these things are integral to who Janey is and how she lives her life. Janey is many, many things, fluctuating things, all at once. She, like the cosmic Zora, becomes her own force of nature. But what do you think? Have you read the firecracker of a novel that is Their Eyes Were Watching God? And if so, did you love it as much as I did? What's your favourite love story? Please let me know in the comments below. As I think I've sufficiently hammered home, I think Their Eyes Were Watching God is a rare gem of a love story. Much better than silly old Romeo and Juliet. But if you do want to learn more about what makes Shakespeare's best-known tragic love story so incredibly successful, click here next.